The night that just passed over the Middle East was not merely a battle, but a definitive verdict delivered from the skies, written in fire across northern Israel and deeply felt within the trembling corridors of the Pentagon thousands of miles away. When the first salvos left their launch rails in the early hours of the morning, the entire world was still operating under a set of comfortable assumptions that had securely governed regional security thinking for more than 3 decades. Yet, by the time the very last contrail faded from the horizon, every single one of those long-held assumptions had been completely reduced to ash. 300 missiles and kamikaze drone systems were unleashed in a coordinated strike package of a precision and scale that absolutely no Western defense analyst had publicly projected as being operationally feasible for Iran at this current stage. The target was not symbolic, but rather functional, deliberate, and chosen with the cold, calculated logic of a military command that has spent years carefully mapping every single vulnerability in Israel's defensive architecture. This was the night the world order fundamentally fractured, proving that the technological mythology of the West could indeed be shattered. To truly understand what transpired in the early hours of this morning, you must first understand what Nevatim Air Base represents inside the strategic doctrine of the Israel Defense Forces. This is not simply another standard military installation. Nevatim is the operational home of Israel's F-35I Adir fleet, housing 50-plus fifth-generation stealth aircraft that represent the single most significant qualitative military advantage Israel holds over every single adversary in its regional environment. These are absolutely not defensive platforms. The F-35I is designed as a first-strike weapon, engineered specifically to penetrate denied airspace, deliver precision munitions against hardened targets, and seamlessly return without being detected. Israel's entire offensive strategic posture, which heavily includes any contemplated strike against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, flows directly through Nevatim. Iran knew exactly what it was targeting. This was not a base chosen for mere symbolic value or fleeting psychological impact. It was chosen because eliminating or significantly degrading the F-35 fleet effectively changes the entire military balance of the Middle East in a single operational sequence. The primary operating facility for these stealth fighters, the absolute crown jewel of the IDF's air superiority doctrine, and the single most expensive military investment the Israeli state has ever made, absorbed direct hits. These hits sent massive columns of black smoke climbing high into the morning sky, a destruction that was entirely visible from 40 kilometers away. The targeting intelligence that ultimately made this specific strike possible represents years of patient collection, deep analysis, and constant refinement. A sustained intelligence effort that Israeli and American security services completely failed to detect, interdict, or disrupt in time to actually matter. But the fiery destruction of highly expensive hangars and aircraft was only the surface level of what truly happened tonight. The far deeper catastrophe for Tel Aviv was the systematic and brutal exposure of the Iron Dome. This system was the technological mythology that Israel and its steadfast Western backers had spent billions of dollars and decades of relentless propaganda constructing, pitching it as an impenetrable wall standing between Israeli civilians and any conceivable threat. Tonight, that wall was not just breached, it was fundamentally demolished. Of the 300 inbound targets, fewer than 200 were successfully intercepted. 100 projectiles reached their specifically designated impact points, and the mathematics of that catastrophic failure will undoubtedly haunt Israeli defense planners for a generation to come. What does it actually mean when Iron Dome, a defensive system that absorbed more than $1 billion in American taxpayer funding, entirely fails to stop 1 in 3 incoming targets during a highly coordinated strike? The strike architecture itself was a masterpiece of layered operational design. The opening phase deployed a dense swarm of low-cost decoy UAV systems, produced directly in IRGC manufacturing facilities at merely a fraction of the per-unit cost of the highly expensive interceptors they were specifically designed to consume. These decoys were never intended to cause physical damage. Their sole calculated purpose was to force every single battery of Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow interceptors in the northern and central sectors to activate to rapidly burn through their ready-to-fire magazines and to completely saturate the processing capacity of the command and control computers managing the interception sequence. When a radar system is simultaneously tracking over 200 inbound signatures and the fire control algorithm is desperately allocating interceptors against each one, the computational load directly approaches the absolute design ceiling of the system. Response times inevitably extend, prioritization errors massively increase, and the gaps that suddenly open in the coverage matrix are absolutely not random. They are the highly predictable result of an intelligent adversary who has extensively studied the system's exact behavior under saturation conditions for years. Directly into those gaping holes came the terrifying second wave, consisting of precision-guided ballistic missiles carrying specialized warheads meticulously calibrated for hardened infrastructure. They targeted reinforced hangar doors, critical fuel and munitions, storage facilities, and essential radar and communications nodes. These were not reckless weapons fired in the general direction of a target and clumsily adjusted post-impact. They were advanced weapons assigned to specific GPS coordinates, flawlessly flying terminal guidance profiles that executed last-second evasive maneuvers to decisively defeat the few interceptors that managed to successfully engage them. The results at Nevatim were captured first not by highly classified military reconnaissance assets, but rather by the ordinary smartphones of Israeli civilians living in communities well within visual range of the base. Video footage circulating within mere minutes of the massive strike showed multiple direct impact points across the military installation, secondary explosions entirely consistent with munitions, storage penetration, and raging fires that the base's own suppression systems were visibly and completely unable to contain. The technical story of tonight's devastating strike begins not with the physical missiles themselves, but with the profound decision Iran made decades ago. It was the strategic decision to fundamentally treat Western sanctions not as a restrictive ceiling on Iranian capability, but rather as an explicit engineering specification. Every single component that foreign suppliers outright refused to provide quickly became a design problem to be brilliantly solved domestically. The primary strike weapon in tonight's package was the Khaybar-Shekin, a highly advanced ballistic missile whose designation literally translates directly as fortress breaker, a name that unequivocally turned out to be operationally accurate in the most literal sense imaginable. The terminal phase flight profile of the Khaybar-Shekin introduces exactly what defense engineers formally call maneuvering re-entry vehicle behavior. The lethal warhead does not simply fall along a predictable ballistic arc in its final seconds of flight. Instead, it executes complex lateral and vertical maneuvers at hypersonic velocities, drastically changing its approach angle and trajectory in ways that completely defeat the lead angle prediction algorithms that Patriot and Arrow interceptors absolutely depend on for successful engagement. To successfully intercept a maneuvering re-entry vehicle, a defensive missile must not aim at where the target currently is, but rather it must mathematically aim at where the target will be when the interceptor finally arrives. If the target unpredictably changes its position during that tight intercept window, the defensive missile misses entirely. Furthermore, the cost asymmetry heavily embedded in this specific weapons mix absolutely deserves extended attention because it is the actual financial engine that continuously drives the entire strategic logic of Iran's approach. A Khaybar-Shekin missile costs Iran approximately $500,000 to $800,000 to effectively produce. Conversely, a single Tamir interceptor missile fired from an Iron Dome battery famously carries a unit acquisition cost of $40,000 to $50,000. But to achieve a highly reliable probability of kill against a single maneuvering target, Israeli doctrine rigidly requires firing 2 interceptors simultaneously, instantly bringing the actual intercept cost to $80,000 to $100,000 per engagement. Against a more advanced ballistic threat, strictly requiring engagement by David's sling or arrow, the interceptor cost dramatically climbs to between $1 million and $3.5 million per single round. When Iran decisively fires 300 mixed targets in a single operational sequence, and Israel is aggressively forced to engage each one through its layered defense architecture, the per-night cost differential rapidly runs into hundreds of millions of dollars. Iran is spending merely a tiny fraction of what Israel must continually expend, simply to sustain its defensive posture. This is the deliberate economic kill chain that Iran's military planners have successfully constructed with the very same deliberate precision they applied to the kinetic design of the physical strike itself. The ultimate goal is not to achieve outright military victory in a single exchange, but to aggressively impose a crippling rate of resource consumption on the defender that simply cannot be sustained across the duration of a protracted conflict. And then there was the specific moment that crystallized absolutely everything. The singular moment that rapidly transformed a military engagement into a massive geopolitical earthquake. As Iranian strike packages were still tracking menacingly toward their targets, the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group and its heavily armed accompanying vessels quietly began dramatically increasing their distance from the volatile Gulf of Oman. There was absolutely no grand announcement, no defensive press conference, just the raw sound of enormous turbines accelerating away from a theater that the United States Navy had always arrogantly treated as its own sovereign operating space. The world's absolute most expensive symbols of American military dominance were rapidly repositioning not toward the fight, but decisively away from it. At what precise moment did the United States Navy quietly calculate that simply staying in the Gulf of Oman was no longer a viable option? And what exactly does that calculation boldly reveal about the real limits of American power projection in 2025? For the entire American century, the ultimate instrument of global power has been the carrier strike group. Since the end of the Second World War, the movement of American carrier groups has undeniably been the primary language through which Washington strongly communicates its intentions, its rock-solid commitments, and its dire warnings to every single government on the planet. When a carrier group moves aggressively toward a crisis, it clearly means America is deeply engaged. When it moves away, it signifies something else entirely. Tonight, two highly advanced carrier strike groups aggressively moved away, increasing their distance from Iranian anti-ship missile engagement envelopes, rather than forcefully decreasing it. To understand exactly why this staggering retreat happened, you have to truly understand what Iran has steadily built in the waters and coastal geography surrounding the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman over the past 15 years. The military doctrine is known as anti-access area denial, a complex strategy designed not to outright defeat an adversary in open battle, but to actively make the cost of entering and operating within a defined geographic zone prohibitively high. Iran's architecture in this specific region is among the most highly developed and deeply layered in the entire world. At the outer layer sits Iran's formidable inventory of long-range anti-ship ballistic missiles, which firmly represent a category of weapon that the United States Navy has absolutely no historical experience properly defending against in a live combat environment. These lethal weapons steeply dive onto their target from high altitude in the terminal phase, an attack geometry that heavily optimized American naval air defense systems simply struggle to defeat. A highly vulnerable carrier strike group, quietly sitting within range of these advanced systems, is absolutely not in a safe operating environment. Furthermore, inside that outer layer strictly sits Iran's massive inventory of anti-ship cruise missiles, low-altitude sea-skimming weapons aggressively deployed from multiple platforms that easily defeat standard radar detection. When the tactical officers directly aboard American carrier groups frantically ran their complex threat assessment calculations on the specific night of Iran's massive strike against Nevatim, the chilling picture that emerged was absolutely not ambiguous. The Gulf of Oman had definitively become a highly dangerous zone where the severe risk to irreplaceable strategic naval assets greatly exceeded any reasonable operational justification for remaining anchored. Losing an American aircraft carrier to Iranian anti-ship missiles in the highly contested Gulf of Oman would be the single most catastrophic blow to American global prestige since the tragic fall of Saigon. This tactical decision to rapidly reposition was not an act of cowardice. It was a highly rational calculation by professional military officers who deeply understood that the strategic environment had fundamentally changed in profound ways that made the previous forward positioning entirely untenable. However, rational or absolutely not, the long-term strategic consequences of that naval repositioning are tremendously severe and totally immediate. Every single government in the broader region intensely watched those massive ships move. Every single government instantly drew the exact same sobering conclusion: that highly touted American security guarantees in the Middle East carry strict conditions that were completely undisclosed previously. For the extremely wealthy Gulf states that have fully oriented their entire regional security architecture strictly around American protection, this event is not a mere abstract geopolitical observation. It is an urgent existential reassessment that will forcefully drive highly concrete policy changes in the tumultuous months ahead. For the state of Israel, the dire implications are vastly more direct. The carrier groups were strategically positioned in the region explicitly to fiercely deter Iranian escalation and to constantly provide Israel with the ironclad assurance that immense American military power faithfully stood behind its security commitments. That highly valued assurance has now been deeply empirically tested and clearly found to carry sharp limits that Israel's conservative government had never properly factored into its complex strategic planning. The smoldering F-35s aggressively burning at Nevatim were definitely not magically saved by sweeping American intervention. Israel ultimately fought this terrifying night largely alone, with American assistance strictly constrained to mere intelligence sharing and the incredibly hollow political cover of standard diplomatic statements, neither of which actually stopped a single Iranian missile. There is an elusive quality of pure military effectiveness that absolutely no swollen defense budget can seamlessly purchase, and no grand alliance relationship can artificially transfer. It is the exact quality that Iranian military forces boldly demonstrated tonight in every single phase of the incredibly complex operation. That highly rare quality is absolute strategic clarity, the complete and utter alignment between a nation's deep understanding of exactly why it is relentlessly fighting, precisely what it is fiercely fighting for, and what it is thoroughly willing to bitterly sacrifice to achieve its ultimate objectives. When soldiers are unfortunately fighting for a mere abstraction, for an artificial alliance relationship, or for a fragile political commitment made by a distant foreign government, their true performance ceiling is fundamentally lower. Israel's military power, while historically and technically formidable, precariously rests on a fragile foundation that has a severe structural fragility that instantly becomes visible under sustained, heavy pressure. The IDF's highly praised equipment is largely American in ultimate origin or deeply American in essential funding. Its most highly capable offensive platform, the advanced F-35I, strictly exists only because the United States graciously provided it and continually provides the essential parts, complex software updates, and rigorous technical support practically required to miraculously keep it fully operational. Even its heavily lauded air defense architecture was extensively co-developed with key American partners and helplessly depends on constant American resupply to simply maintain its crucial interceptor magazines. Tonight was unequivocally a massive moment of extreme maximum pressure when the true depth of that strategic dependency was brutally and fully exposed in stunning real time. The highly advanced F-35s at Nevatim absolutely could not safely take off and swiftly respond to the blistering attack that was systematically destroying their base simply because the base itself was the primary target. The critical interceptors that were supposed to reliably protect those grounded aircraft completely ran out long before the overwhelming strike packages did. The contrast between Iran's hard-fought self-sufficiency and Israel's glaring structural dependency is absolutely not merely a convenient political talking point. It is the exact operational explanation for the final outcome of tonight's fierce engagement. A hardened military force that relies entirely on its own society for literally everything it practically needs, fights vastly differently than a heavily dependent military force whose very sustainability is entirely contingent on the continued, wavering goodwill of a distant foreign patron. When Iran's patron calculus has never even been a restrictive factor, simply because Iran diligently builds exactly what it needs internally, that severe external constraint simply does not remotely exist. Step completely back from the highly granular military details of tonight's engagement and critically look at the massive structural picture that has been forcefully revealed. What the globe clearly witnessed tonight was absolutely not simply Iran boldly conducting a large-scale strike against highly protected Israeli military infrastructure. What we collectively witnessed was the undeniable operational proof of a major geopolitical thesis about the true nature of power in the chaotic, contemporary international system. The grand unipolar moment, that unique historical period directly following the end of the Cold War, during which immense American military, economic, and normative dominance was entirely sufficient to single-handedly determine outcomes across every single significant international security situation, is unequivocally over. It is not merely fading. It is not slowly declining. It is decisively over. The dramatic events of tonight in the blazing skies over northern Israel and the turbulent waters of the Gulf of Oman definitively constitute empirical evidence for this staggering conclusion. Tonight, Iran unequivocally demonstrated that it possesses the precise capability to successfully impose entirely unacceptable costs on mighty American naval forces actively operating in the region's contested waters. The highly visible repositioning of heavily armed American carriers in direct response to massive Iranian anti-access area denial activation is the unmistakable visible marker of a major credibility threshold being permanently crossed. For both Moscow and Beijing, tonight's highly dramatic events carry a distinct quality of absolute strategic confirmation that their incredibly patient, long-term, massive investment in the broader multipolar project has been brilliantly and completely vindicated. Russia's deep defense cooperation with isolated Iran has heavily contributed materially to the exact devastating capability that was boldly demonstrated tonight. Chinese massive strategic patience, heavily involving the sustained, quiet cultivation of vast economic relationships thoroughly across the entire region, is also strongly positioned to greatly yield massive returns as the broader regional order rapidly rebalances fiercely away from its previous heavily American-centric configuration. The broader global south, that massive constellation of rapidly developing nations that have long bitterly chafed under decades of highly restrictive, Western-imposed harsh economic and political frameworks, will fiercely draw their own deeply empowering conclusions from tonight's fiery demonstration. The powerful message that Iran's highly effective performance relentlessly transmits to every single government that has ever directly faced massive American coercive diplomacy, crippling economic sanctions, political pressure, or direct military threat is entirely straightforward and tremendously powerful. Genuine self-sufficiency is absolutely achievable. Credible deterrence is entirely buildable. And the arrogant assumption that perceived Western technological superiority will always effortlessly translate into guaranteed operational dominance in absolutely every single environment is a massive, dangerous myth that has now been extremely visibly debunked for the entire globe to see. The completely obsolete old order in the volatile Middle East was solidly built on several deeply interlocking strategic pillars. Tonight, Absolutely every single one of those foundational pillars was severely stress tested simultaneously, and every single one catastrophically showed massive, fatal fractures that will unequivocally not be magically repaired by the very next massive resupply flight rushing from Andrews Air Force Base, or the very next highly theatrical emergency session loudly convened at the UN Security Council. What brutally played out over the dark skies of terrified Israel tonight and aggressively across the dark waters of the Gulf of Oman was not just another fleeting news story. It was a massive, irreversible turning point, the exact terrifying kind that firmly secures an entire bloody chapter in global history books written many decades from now. Iron Dome absolutely did not solidly hold. The highly prized F-35 base definitively did not survive completely intact. The massive American carriers emphatically did not courageously stay. And the fundamentally changed world that rapidly emerges from the ashes of this historic night is absolutely not the very same confident world that blindly entered it. The only massive debate that actually matters right now is not whether a heavily sanctioned Iran has boldly proven something. The debate is exactly what the newly proven, undeniable capability of a completely self-reliant, strictly strategically coherent Iran genuinely means for absolutely every single other delicate calculation currently being frantically made in this highly unstable region and vastly beyond. The rapid, unpredictable trajectory of that intense global debate will permanently shape the Middle East, and by direct extension, the entire global energy and massive security architecture for the next highly turbulent decade at minimum.